Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. So, this will be the second part of the lecture on the Great Depression. If you haven't watched the first one, please do. But just to give you a review, what I was discussing was the aspects that lead up to the economic crisis that has been historically named the Great Depression. One of the areas that we need to try to understand that actually is the that actually is the main culprit of all of our economic issues is what we would call deregulation. Okay. And deregulation or a lack of regulation. So maybe at one point there was regulation and then it was, removed, or there had never really been any regulation, so it was just a free market. And so what leads up to the crisis of 1929 and then extends well into the 1930s is a confluence of factors. The main of which is a lack of controls in the economy, mainly that of the federal government in terms of being able to guide, protect monetary policy, being able to intervene in terms of, an economic crisis and when it's happening. And recall when we looked at the economic crisis, like the panic of 1897, in 1893, and if we go into various economic panics, is that remember the prevailing approach by those who are in power is that just to allow the market to solve itself, and in particular with the financial panic of 1897 is that was one of the areas where you first saw how intervening in the economy was necessary. Why? Well, it is because the panics that had happened prior to that period were small enough to where the majority of the population wasn't affected to the degree that people were heavily reliant on a company, on a employer to provide for their daily economic sustenance, wages and such. As we get into the 1890s, we see that move, remember, that move from people working in rural areas to more urban. It's much more basically breakdown between 50 and 50-50. And we see that more people are earning their wages from an actual private industry. So this means that they depend on their livelihood by earning money. If there is an economic crisis, that means that those individuals who had depended on the factory work, on being employed, are laid off. And because there are no financial regulations or controls or intervening approaches, policies, or even attitudes at the time, many people go hungry, they starve to death, they basically fall into economic dire straits, and that's where you have these crises. And so, what we're going to look at with the crash of 1929 and the subsequent depression, economic depression that happens through the 1930s, is we're going to see how this approach to really not taking an involvement in the economy really changes. And it's largely due to the fact of the severity of the crisis itself, that there was a crisis of such magnitude that the majority of the country was being affected in such a negative way that the government had to act, that there was something that must be done to be able to try to solve this crisis. Okay. But remember, from the previous lecture, we have to look at a couple of things. Remember, the economy after the post-war period, 1919, all the way up until 1929, is booming. Why is that? Well, because remember, Europe is decimated. There is little production that is going on in Europe, and yet there is still a desire for goods. The United States has an economy that is largely intact. We have natural resources, we have the labor, we have the entrepreneurship, and therefore we are able to produce and meet the demands of not only our nation, but of the world. And so we become that economy that is producing en masse on huge scales goods and services that the world desires. And with the changes in technology, with the changes in industrialized production, right, we're able to produce items that once were considered such a luxury that now can be afforded by individuals who are of modest means. And because of the new economic approaches to buying goods and services, namely the ability to buy on credit, right? This put down a small down payment, pay something now, pay the rest later over time. We have more and more people consuming, spending more money, and because of the changes in terms of labor, there's far more leisure, right? And so as we looked at that aspect of this idea of consuming goods because of an experience that you want to be able to have that's associated with that product, right? Whether that's a car, a fur coat, a vacation, right? The idea of consumption becomes linked to this idea of an experience, that a good, that a service, that an experience can give you something and provide something to you beyond its technical or basic design applications, right? It's not just a refrigerator. It's not just a radio. It's not just a car. It's a lifestyle, right? This is where we get the first modern sense of branding, right? How we associate a product with a various experience or a type of person. And so this is all these confluence of factors that leads us into this area in terms of what is going to lead to the Great Depression. Okay. So we are having hyper consumerism. We have hyper, productivity. Remember, with the opportunities that are happening in terms of production, industrialization, as well as consumption and buying on credit, these are the severe factors that are ultimately going to lead to these problems. Okay, so take a look at there are two links on the module that you can look at in terms of the Great Depression. These are some, they're quite dated in terms of when they were done. I think these were done in the late 80s or early 1990s. So yeah, they are, kind of old. But nonetheless, the characteristics, the flavor, the information is still very much relevant. So it gives you a lot of firsthand accounts for people who actually lived during the Depression, what exactly those challenges were. And for the purposes of, for this lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Great Depression, and we're also going to look at the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. So we're going to look at the parallels between the two, particularly in terms of the causes and the consequences, as well as the responses from those who were from the political parties and the political leadership of the period. Okay, so to give you just a brief synopsis, on the eve of the stock market crash that's going to happen in October of 1929, you have an economy that is booming, right? We are producing products, we're producing services, people can buy on credit, right? And there's a heavy amount of speculation that this growth is just going to continue. Now, here's a couple of things that we should also know. Now, when you are producing massive amounts of products, right? Refrigerators, washing machines, automobiles, radios, right? These products have to get purchased, right? They have to be, somebody has to be consuming them. But how many cars do you need? How many radios, how many refrigerators do you need? And unlike today, goods that were built back in the 1920s actually lasted for quite a long time. They were actually very durable. So, it wasn't just that you bought a new refrigerator and you had it for a year and then you threw it out. You kept it. You kept it for several years and then you could get it repaired, right? So there was consumption and there was usage, but there wasn't, when you think of a market, right? The market, in terms of this, is one of the biggest challenges with capitalism, is that capitalism always has to continue to expand, right? It heavily depends on constant consumption. When that consumption slows down, as it was slowing down around 1928, is that you saw that people were starting to buy less. And the reason why they were buying less is because, well, there's a couple of reasons. One was that people were starting to get a little bit concerned about the buying on credit, particularly the banks as well as the companies that were lending on credit, right? People were not necessarily paying them back as quickly. They were not, paying their debts, and debts were late. And so when this starts to happen, this is how the cycle begins, right? Everything is good because, people are working, they're producing, people are consuming, spending, and then that money goes back into the company and they're able to pay people and the cycle just continues. Well, if people stop consuming, if they're not buying as many goods and services, right, this slows down the amount of orders. If there's less orders, then there's less production. Less production means the less people, means you don't have to be paying as many people, which means that people may not necessarily have the money to buy the products to consume to keep the cycle going, right? So this is where the problem begins, is that it begins with this idea of credit, that people were not necessarily meeting their credit obligations, and that which they were spending or that they wanted to consume was not matching their incomes, right? People were actually spending far more than they were actually earning. And so we're already starting to see this level in terms of an income to debt ratio in the late 1920s that was already starting to create some sort of concerns of speculation. The other areas of concerns in terms of the 1929 stock market crash that leads to this is what has been called historically as Black Tuesday. Is that what we saw in 1929 on Black Tuesday is that we saw an enormous amount of selling of assets, right? Essentially, what had happened was is that when you have various people who are speculating on various companies in terms of their expansion, in terms of their growth, right? You have this idea that, well, if people aren't as confident that, people are paying their debts, that people are going to be able to make payroll, that people are going to be able to produce X amount of goods and services, that changes the confidence level, and then people begin to pull out. Well, what ends up happening is that if some people start to pull out, this basically sets off like alarms for other people who are investors. Like, well, wait a second, if everybody's pulling out and I'm dependent on these investors, then other people are going to pull out. I need to protect my money before I lose everything. And so it just creates a cascading effect. Now, normally, panics like this, while they do contribute, and this is what you may want to recognize as the start of the Great Depression. The question is exactly like how does it linger? And that's what we'll get into in the subsequent uh, slides here. But in addition to the stock market crash, remember there's also other areas in the financial system that is not very well protected. So remember, if people are able to buy on credit, that means that we also have a banking system that isn't very well regulated. Okay, so think about it like this. If a bank is able to lend on you and to say, like, well, you know what, we can give you X amount of dollars for your mortgage and you only have to pay us this much back. Well, if they're not getting their money back because somebody has lost their job, because somebody isn't able to, pay as much and they can only pay some, that money is still left on that debt is still left on the books of the bank. And the banking system at the time, remember, these banks are very much locally run, right? We do not have a federal entire system, like what we call the Federal Reserve System, where you have a centralized bank as well as, several different feeler banks that are there to monitor the system. Banks are largely, local run. And so it's based on how many depositors you have, how much money is in the system. And because if the banking system isn't strong, if there are not regulations, like for instance, how much money a bank has to have on hand, how much they are able to keep in terms of debts on their books, how much they have to have in terms of liquid assets. None of that is established in this period, in the 1920s, because everybody thought that the economy was going to keep expanding and growing and consuming and everything will be fine. So why would we worry, right? Well, there's plenty to worry about because of this weak banking system. Because what happens is that when the stock market crashes, people begin to immediately begin to worry about what exactly is going to be happening with their money that's in the bank, right? So people immediately start to pull money out. This is what we call a bank run. So when people pull out money from their bank, this can create what is known as a liquidity problem for the bank itself, which means that the bank is no longer financially solvent because all of the depositors that had money in the bank that the bank uses to loan out money to other people to put other investments is no longer there, so that the bank is just closes. Okay. So this is one of the other contributing factors. And you've probably even seen an example, like if you've ever seen like a bank run, it sort of looks like this in the 1930s, when you have people literally running into the bank and they are trying to pull out their money. Now, if you do this now, so let's say you want to go into the bank and you're like, hey, I want to pull out all of my money. Well, if you want to get, let's say, cash, right? If let's say you have a huge deposit, like you have like somewhere in the range of, let's say, like 50 or $100,000, chances are the bank does not have $100,000 in cash inside of the bank, right? And there's a couple reasons for that. A, in order to get all that cash, it has to be sent from other banks in order for them to acquire it. Two, it makes you susceptible to being robbed. So you don't necessarily want to have all this cash on hand. But at the time, banks had this cash. It was in the bank, and so these depositors would pull it out. Well, when this happens, this makes the bank, insolvent and it just closes. And because there's no protections in that, this is one of the biggest problems that is going to be contributing to the extension of the Great Depression because the banking system itself is not able to be regulated to a point where a bank has to have certain standards to be able to protect the depositors as well as to maintain that sense of confidence. The other thing that was going to further exacerbate the Great Depression was the simple fact of trade policies. Now, much like today, you have people in positions of political authority that have various perspectives in terms of the economy. Now, our current president and many of his, economic advisors believe in this idea that it is a good idea to keep consumption, excuse me, production and consumption within our borders. That if we're going to have trade, it needs to be trade that's favorable to us, and that we have, as President Trump has often called it, good and fair trade deals. Well, sounds like a great idea, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? Problem is with Trump's approach to that is this idea that we actually manufacture goods and services here in the United States. Manufacturing in the United States largely ended by the late 1970s, early 1980s, with the arrival of globalization and the ability for companies to go and produce goods and services in other countries and send the products either back to the United States or to other developed countries for consumption. What Trump is wanting to do is he wants to be able to encourage people to produce, to have a factory, to produce a good or a service here in the United States, and to be able to produce it here so that it can be consumed by the American population and then it can be sold to other people out there. Not a bad idea. Here's the problem is that manufacturing requires infrastructure. And while yes, we do have space and we have the room to build, these large factories, building a factory isn't something that you can just do within a year, right? Sometimes this can take 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, right? There are regulations, there are rules that have to be established depending on the locality, the state, the taxes, all of these things. And so when you look at this, it's like, well, yeah, it sounds like a great idea, but that's the problem is that, if you don't necessarily have the infrastructure to do it, this is going to be very, very difficult for a company that even would love to be able to do it, just is unable to. How Trump is doing this to inspire people to want to buy American and to build here in America is he is using what they used back in the 1920s and 1930s, which were tariff policies. Now, a tariff is a very simply, if you just want to understand it, is basically a tax that is assigned to a good or a service that is coming from an outside country into ours. So if we have a good that is coming in from Europe, a tariff can be assigned to it if the United States produces a similar product to that. And then this can allow you to encourage your local population to buy what is local and to maybe not buy this because it's more expensive. Okay. And this can work for, a couple of things, but there's many things that here in the United States that we don't produce, but that we do consume quite a bit of. So, and this was one of the first things that, Trump and his trade advisors, began to put tariffs on that actually ended up hurting Americans in terms of their consumption and actually costing them more money because of the cost in terms of these services. So one example is going to be coffee. Okay. So coffee, we don't produce coffee in the United States mainly because we can't. We don't have the right region for it, right? Coffee is produced in subtropical areas. So these are areas like Mexico, the Central America, places like Bolivia, Colombia, right? Brazil, right? These are areas that produce coffee. Jamaica produces coffee, right? These are, countries that can produce coffee because they have the areas, they have the beans, and most importantly, they have the weather. So we don't grow coffee here, so we have to import it. So that's automatically going to be a problem. Now, if you look at that just on that simple product alone, think of all of the coffee companies that exist. Starbucks, Peet's Coffee, your local coffee grinder, right? If they have to now charge $1 more per cup, that's going to cause many people to be able to say to themselves, well, you know what? Maybe I don't need to go here and buy this coffee. If people don't buy the product, then they can't pay the people. If they can't pay the people, then those people can't pay taxes. They don't buy other products. And then the cycle just creates more and more of a problem, right? Take other products that we don't really produce, that we don't produce here. Bananas, right? Can't grow bananas, right? Most of our fruit that we grow because we don't live in a society where, yeah, we love to just eat fruits that are in season like most countries do. We can have strawberries all year round and or cherries all year round or watermelon all year round. I wouldn't recommend eating it in the winter since it probably doesn't taste very good, but we can still access that because that's the type of economies that we live in. But when you put tariffs on these items, in these everyday items that people had once depended on, and the taxes go on to it, this creates a strain on the consumer and it changes their behavior in terms of what they consume, how much, and how often. Well, this is the same thing that happened in the 1930s, is that these protectionist trade policies, they're known as the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Acts, which basically raised the cost to import goods as an idea that this would spur manufacturing in the United States, that people would be able to get back in terms of production and that they wouldn't, have an influx of foreign goods. Well, the problem with that is that it didn't do anything to it didn't do anything to be able to spur global trade because this is inevitably what happens. If you put a tariff on a good from another country, they're going to do the same thing for your goods and services. So while we can put a tariff on olive oil from Italy, they're going to put a tariff on our, soybeans or our rice or our wheat, right? And they're not going to buy it either. And so then what ends up happening now, as it did in the 1930s, is that global trade is affected. And in the 1930s, it was far worse. Global trade actually collapsed as a result of this because there was no ability for people to be able to just produce and consume because there was all of these taxes on it, all of these tariffs, all of these, price hikes. And this is what is very problematic because when you have tariffs in place and when you have these aspects is that it changes the most important thing which is needed in any economy, no matter what the time period is, whether it is the 1930s, whether it is now, whether it is in the future, is that you have to have confidence. Confidence is what keeps people spending, right? Confidence, this belief, this hope, this trust that my dollar is going to mean something, that the cost of this good is going to be this much, this is going to affect my behavior. So for instance, a business, if they are not able to be confident to know that President Trump is not going to just randomly decide to put on a tariff or decide to raise the rates or decide to stop people from traveling or to stop people from coming to school or starting a business, right? All of these things affect one's confidence and it changes your behavior. The worst thing that in a capitalist economy is to have people changing their behavior in terms of their consumption, how much and how often. Because if people change their consumption behavior, the system itself ceases to work. It can slow down, if not ultimately stop, because if people stop consuming, then people can't produce. Without production, there is no money. If there's no money, then there's no credit. If there's no credit, then there's no consumption. And then we just keep going around in this cycle. Okay. And so, what is important to understand is that while the 1920s and 1929, the stock market crash was essentially what started the Great Depression. What kept it going was a loss of credit, right? Because people's behaviors and their consumptions had changed. And because there was no ability to extend credit, because the banking system is weak, it keeps closing, it doesn't have enough money. The stock market is in free for all. People are buying and selling, and there's no way of knowing where exactly or how exactly we're going to be able to manage the next day. And the trade policies are affecting the ability to produce because we produce something, they put a tax on our goods that we're trying to sell out. People are putting tax on goods that are coming in. It's too expensive to buy, it's too expensive to produce. This just creates an economic crisis. And so we are in a very similar position, right? That while no, we are not in a period what we would consider a Great Depression, but we are certainly in a position where we are in economic concern or an economic weakness. What we see is that our economy is often judged by several different factors, right? There's many ways to measure the success or the strength of it. One way is to look at GDP, what is known as gross domestic product, right? How much the country is producing in terms of its economic output. Another way to maybe look at is to look at the stock market, right? To see how well people are doing in terms of the consumption, the production of goods and services, X, Y, and Z. Another way is to look at it as the consumer confidence index, what is known as the CCI, right? These are the way that people feel about the economy, that they feel that, yeah, it's going well, or no, it's not, right? Many people are questioning the ability, how they can afford groceries or afford rent or be able to buy a home or to start a business or to, afford school, right? These are all things that affect the economy because they all affect behaviors, right? Your confidence, right? If you have money in the stock market, you're doing great, right? Because is the stock market doing quite well? Quite well. It is. But guess what? Only about maybe almost 50% of Americans have money in the stock market, right? The other half of Americans depend on their paychecks. And if they depend on their paychecks and they lose their job, then they are no longer able to consume like they did. If they have a paycheck, but they see that the same items that they keep purchasing continually go up in cost, they consume less, right? So then that changes their behavior. So when we look at the Great Depression, what we look at is some of these key effects of these events that happen. The biggest one is, of course, mass unemployment. At its peak in 1933, you're looking at almost about a 30% in terms of people that were unemployed. So 3 out of every 10. On average, between the period of 1929 and 1939, you're looking at about a 20% in terms of unemployment. Right now, the unemployment rate is at about 3%. So if you think about it and you think of like, now, yes, are there more people in the country today than there were in 1920 and 1929? Absolutely. If you look at that aspect, but in terms of like the numbers, right? In terms of the numbers, we're looking at a Great Depression in terms of the aspect of, 30%, 3 out of every 10 people are out of work, right? We're also looking at people who are underemployed, people that are not, full-time employed, maybe they're part-time, right? These are all these factors. And so with massive unemployment comes a massive loss in terms of tax revenue, in terms of consumption, in terms of production. So millions of people lost their jobs in the 1930s. As a result of the job loss, because these are people who once worked in factories, once were in producing goods and services, GDP falls dramatically. Okay. This means that there is a huge decline in terms of output, right? This is the output in terms of radios, refrigerators, cars, light bulbs, right? All of the things that once made the economy extremely strong and reliant, now it suddenly is no longer. And so, of course, the depression is not just tied to the United States. This actually becomes a worldwide depression because with the enactment of tariffs, this affects production in all sectors of the globe. that because this is a world that is becoming far more integrated in terms of its trade. And remember, this is the 1930s. The war ends in 1919. We're only looking at, a difference of 11 years. The economy in Europe was still very much debilitated. It had not gotten to its point where it was at full steam by the 1930s because they were still trying to do the recovery. And so by the time the Depression rolls around, it further complicates that issue, which is going to lead to further issues in terms of the social and political anxiety that would be characteristic of the 1930s, particularly in Germany, that would lead to World War II. So let's take a look at some of the aspects of the 2007, 2008, 2009 financial crisis. So, for those of you who are old enough, who were around at this time, um, there were several factors that contributed to this. The main one is going to be the aspect of deregulation. Deregulation in terms of banks and investment capital companies in terms of what exactly they were able to do with these investments when selling to potential buyers. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a clip from the movie called The Big Short. Maybe you've seen it. But what I want you to do is I want you to look and watch this clip and listen to what people are saying in terms of the consumption, right, of home purchases. Okay. Let me just go ahead and pull it up here for you. Here we go.
The market's in an itsy bitsy little gully right now. It's like everybody said, okay, that was crazy. Let's just all calm down. I saw that house for 350 the year it was built. 2 years later, 480. Then 585, maybe 18 months ago. This couple bought it for 650 last year. He'd let it go for that. I jumped. Will break his heart, but he'll let it go.
Why is he selling?
Neither one's working right now.
Orly, you'd say they're motivated, right?
As motivated as one can be in this neighborhood. This house on the left, I'd say they're probably motivated.
Wow, a lot of people seem very motivated.
Oh, it's just the gully. That's all. Just nerves. So where do we stand?
I need to talk to my wife.
This market won't last.
Actually, could I talk to a mortgage broker? Anybody you recommend? Anybody you like?
Yes, have someone, absolutely.
Yeah, bitch better like me. Send her ass to Cabo. So is Morgan Stanley recruiting us? Is that?
Well, no. No, the bank owns our hedge fund, but we're not really a part of it. We invest in financial service companies, and we're trying to understand the residential mortgage business.
How many loans do you write each month?
About 60.
Yeah. What was it 4 years ago?
10, maybe 15.
Yeah, I was a bartender. Now I own a boat.
You own a boat. So how many of these are adjustable rate mortgages?
Well, most.
Yeah, I'd say about 90%. The bonuses on those skyrocketed a few years ago. Adjustables are better, honey. So do applicants ever get rejected?
Seriously?
Look, if they get rejected, I suck at my job.
Well, even if they have no money?
Well, my firm offers ninja loans. No income, no job. I just leave the income section blank if I want. Corporate doesn't care. These people just want homes, and they go with the flow.
Good for you.
Your companies don't verify.
If I write a loan on Friday afternoon, big bank is going to buy it by Monday lunch.
Yeah, same here.
Could you hold on a second?
Yes.
I don't get it. Why are they confessing?
Not confessing.
They're bragging.
Do people have any idea what they are buying?
I'm focused on the immigrants. Once they find out they're getting a home, they sign where you tell them to sign. Don't ask questions. Don't understand the rates.
Like an idiot.
Yeah.
And you target immigrants too.
Their credit actually isn't bad enough for them. Look, I'm a yield guy. Okay. I make $2,000 on fixed rate prime, right? But I can make
10,000 on a subprime adjustable. Trust me, I'm not driving a 7 Series without strippers. No one on the pole has good credit, and they're all cash rich.
I think I read Warren Buffett say something like that. No, not right.
Who's Warren
Yeah.
Buffett?
Okay, so strippers like exotic dancers.
Yeah, yeah. Nude, topless.
Strippers.
Yeah.
Can you introduce us?
Yes. Yes.
I always get option pay adjustables. Private contractor.
What? I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
I always get option pay adjustables. Private contractor. Flexibility.
And you tell the mortgage company what you do?
I write therapist. You can touch me.
Always?
Only in VIP.
No. You say you always do adjustables. And you have more than one loan on a property?
Everybody does. At least down here.
I'm sorry, what?
Everybody does. At least down here. That way you only put down like 5%.
Well, prices have leveled off though, right?
Yeah, it's a goalie.
Would you mind not moving anymore? I'll still pay you.
Sorry. I'm not alone.
Okay, look, if home prices don't go up, you are not going to be able to refinance. And you're going to be stuck paying whatever your monthly payment is once it jumps up after your teaser rate expires. Your monthlies could go up 200-300%.
James says I can always refinance.
Well, he's a liar. Actually, in this particular case, James probably is wrong.
200% on all my loans?
What do you mean all your loans? We're talking about 2 loans on 1 house, right?
I have 5 houses in a condo.
Okay, so there's a lot there to unpack. So let me help you out with this, okay? Because this is one of the things that we're talking about. So when we're comparing this to what was going on in the 1920s, let's look at a lot of the parallels in terms of the environment that we're in, okay? So let's begin with this aspect. Let's start with the stripper, and she's talking to this individual, telling him about, well, this is how much I own, right? So did you hear what she said? She was like, I have 5 houses and a condo, and they all have adjustable rate mortgages, okay? What is known as an ARM, okay? Adjustable rate mortgage. And if you don't know what an ARM is, an adjustable rate mortgage essentially is this, is that it is able to change the interest rate in terms of what are you going to be charged, right, per month, can adjust based off of the market, okay? So it's not what is known as a fixed rate. So that's what is known as traditional, right? You'll hear like I have a 30-year fixed or a 15-year fixed, right? On this home, right? It's going to stay the same interest rate over that period. Well, an adjustable is one that fluctuates and changes. It can work very well if the economy is doing great and the interest rates are low, right? But what happens when the economy tanks? The Federal Reserve says to itself, like, hey, we need to get cash out of there, so we're going to raise the interest rates. Then you're going to see, as you hear in that dialogue, your payment could go up 200%, right? So let's look at the first problem, consumption, right? 5 houses and a condo. Okay, yes, it's America, and yes, it is capitalism, and you should be able to buy whatever you want. But did you notice what exactly she said in terms of, what she puts down in terms of her loan application, and then where exactly those other 2 gentlemen, the mortgage brokers, whom exactly they're targeting, right? The gentleman in the black, the mortgage broker is like, well, I get more money if I get more people to sign on an adjustable rate mortgage. If I can find people who have cash, right, but no credit, that's the reason why they were focusing on strippers and immigrants, right? Individuals that usually have a lot of money, but no actual credit to be able to secure the loan. This is the reason why we're going to do an adjustable rate mortgage, okay? And so what ends up happening is that we see the first problem here is behaviors, right? The behaviors that people are being able to do whatever it is that they want. both the mortgage rate, the mortgage adjusters, these financial backers in terms of who are getting people to sign, as well as the consumer, right? There's no regulation here. And so this is exactly what was going on. You heard in that conversation, um, what was happening is that they were asking the questions. They were like, well, how many loans, do you fill out, per month? And he was like, about 60 loans. And then he asked him, what did you do 4 years ago? He was like 10 a month. So we're looking, so think about that. 6 times the amount within a period of a couple of years. So we're looking at the consumption. So you have to ask yourself is like, okay, so how exactly is that allowed? Like, why exactly did more people get in? Now, if there was a change in the economy, let's say that, oh, more people had money, there was the prices were a little low, there was ability to write more mortgages because the economy was just doing well, right? Well, that's not what was happening. This is that first problem, deregulation. What had happened started in the 1980s essentially was this, is that the regulations that banks had, as well as what loan officers, mortgage brokers, and everything else could do, these things began to change. So, and this one of the reasons why this happened is because in the 1980s, it was very difficult to secure a loan for a house. And because the interest rate was rather high. I believe at the time, probably around in probably the mid to late 80s, it was probably somewhere in the range of like 7 to 9%, which I know many of you are like, well, it's at 6, my God, and I can't afford that. Well, also remember, houses were a little bit cheaper back then. They weren't nearly, the cost that they are today. But the point is that the regulation was based on this theory that if we lower the requirements, right, to be able to get people into a home, right, they will be able to secure it. They'll be able to stimulate the economy with their constant mortgage payments. That money can go into the bank. The bank can lend it back out. And then this can be able to create this cycle. Well, sounds like a great idea, right? Well, fast forward that to the early 2000s, and this is precisely what was starting to happen. So, in the early 2000s, the economy was doing quite well, very similar to what was going on in the 1920s. We were coming out of the late 1990s. The economy is very strong. There's money out there. People are consuming more. And so what exactly do they want to do is they want to reach for that American dream. Well, as you can hear, loan officers are looking for people with good solid credit. So 650 and a down payment of 20%. Well, that regulation goes away. And because the reason is that there was an incentive to be able to get more people to sign because of the financial incentive that you get when people get a loan closed, right? You heard what he said. He was like, I usually get $2,000 on a regular FHA, 30-year fixed. But if I get an adjustable rate, I get 10 grand, right? So here's the incentive, right? No regulation, right? Just do the right thing. Now, here's the problem is that you have individuals that are deciding that, a mortgage company, a bank, right, is saying to this regular individual, well, hey, yeah, we've got this loan for you. We've got this opportunity for you. The regular person on the street is going to assume that the bank knows what they're doing. Why would they give me the money if they don't think that I can afford it? Well, look at this aspect. They're not considering that she has 5 houses and a condo. They're not considering that they have this aspect that she has all of this money out there and that how is she going to repay all this? They just want to get the loan solved so that they can be able to get their commission and be able to have a good life, right? Now, this is where it becomes much more difficult, okay? Because of the deregulation and the ability for people to be able to get loans, instead of having 650 credit and 20%, these people, there's nobody else out there anymore. So now what these loan companies start to do is they change it to an adjustable rate and they go bottom feeding. 600, 590, no down payment, right? Just so that I'm able to get these loans on the books, I can get my commission and move on. And as you can see from those mortgage brokers in the video, they're just like, well, who cares? They don't know what they're signing. They just want homes. Isn't that a good thing? Well, it sounds like a good thing if you can afford it, right? So already we're seeing the consumption and the behavior not being regulated or controlled in any way. We're not seeing any brakes on this train. Now, here's where the second problem comes in. Now, many of these banks knew that it was highly risky to be able to, back people with loans that don't necessarily have stable incomes or jobs, such as strippers, or, immigrants, or people that don't have good credit scores or a history of credit at all, right? So, what the banks decide to do is they decide to buy an insurance on these loans in case they default, right? So in case of, let's just say these loans decide to default at some point, the insurance companies will pay the bank for their loss. Okay. Sounds like a great idea, right? Well, here's what the problem is that the banks decide that if they have this, they're allowed, because there was no regulation at the time, is that the banks were allowed to take those risky mortgages, and if they had an insurance on it, they could write off that risky mortgage off of their books in terms of their finances, meaning that their bank looks like it's actually a lot stronger than it actually is because there's an insurance on those bad debts. So, what exactly do the banks do? Is they keep taking on bad debts and keep buying the insurance. This is where it starts to get really murky, okay? Is that the banks then begin to sell these assets, these mortgage-backed securities, because they've got this insurance swap in case of if it collapses on their books, they've got the insurance to do it this way. They decide to start selling these out on the open market to people who are like, well, it's a couple of subprime loans and mortgages, the economy is doing quite well. It's 2006, everything's great, right? What would be the problem? You're just going to make more money because everybody's paying on their mortgages, right? Well, then remember the first scene from the video. Oh, we're just in a gully. People, did you hear how the prices of those homes went up astronomically? 380, 470, 560, 650. He let it go for that. And they asked the question, well, why are they selling? Neither one is working. Ah. So they're no longer getting a check to be able to pay for the home. So they are not able to consume. That money isn't going in there. So that loan is now a risk on the bank. And now the insurance is going to pay it. Now, what I want you to know is that it wasn't just one bank. All the banks were doing it. Everybody. The only bank that was the most solvent at the time was Wells Fargo. But Chase is involved in it. Bank of America is involved in it. Citi's involved in it. Everybody's involved in these mortgage-backed subprime mortgages, right? And so because everybody thought that the housing market would just keep going up, just like in the 1920s, things are just going to keep getting better. Then prices start to go down. They lose the teaser rate on their mortgage. They're not able to pay. The bank forecloses. The bank forecloses on that. They lose that loan. The insurance swap goes in. But here's the problem. Think of everybody losing their home, everybody at the same time losing, and the banks have to write off this massive thing all at the same time. The financial system was about to collapse. And this was in 2007. Okay. So what we see here is that a change, right? Without that regulation, without these systems, right? Let's look at the similarities. No regulation in terms of how in 1920s, how much money banks have to keep on hand, who they're able to loan out to, this buying on credit behavior, right? In 2007, 2008, who they can loan money out to, don't necessarily have to have certain credits or certain standards, that they can have multiple mortgages out, right? That they can allow in their application, right? All of these regulations, right? Lack of regulations. There are none. Then what we see is the changing in the behaviors. Why? Because the economy is starting to change. And as the economy changes, the crises begin to follow, right? And so what ends up happening, as with the Great Depression and with the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, is a drying up of credit, right? People are not able to get secured in terms of getting money to pay for their home, to start a business, to stock their shelves. And so without that credit, the depression lasts. The financial crisis goes well into 2009, right? And remember, this is a global financial crisis that's happening. Now, let's look at the economic impact that happens as a result of this. Of course, none of you were around in the 1920s, but let's just take a look. So we looked at the unemployment rate, peak of 25% in 1933, about 13 million people out of work, right? Production drops, by about half between 29 and 33. Housing, prices plummet between 1929 and 1932. Consumer prices fall by 25, 32% because nobody's buying or able to afford it. So without the affording of the production, there is less production. Without production, there is no jobs. Without jobs, there is no money. Without money, there is no consumption, right? The cycle just continues. And because of this, without the production, we're not able to sell. If tariffs are put in place, then all this global trade just completely collapses within. Now, let's look at some of the tariffs that were put in place by President Trump. So if we look at the effects of what he did in 2020, is that he affected, right? Because remember how he created that trade war with China and, he was raising consumer prices. Well, what we look at is that we look at the $51 billion in 2018 that was raised as a consequence of the tariffs, right? If we look at right now, the over 128 billion that he's raised, right? That's been paid for by you and me, by the consumption of the goods and services that we consume, that we buy every single day. While that report that came out from the Federal Trade Commission, excuse me, from the Federal Reserve about who is buying and who is paying for these tariffs, it is the companies that is paying for the tariffs who are passing it along to the consumer. The consumer is the individual who always ends up paying the tariffs unless they just stop buying completely, which is very similar to what happened in the 1920s, is that people just stopped buying certain goods and services because they couldn't afford them. Without the purchase of the goods and services, there is no production. Without the production, there is no jobs, no money, no consumption, right? Same thing here. So when we look at like the retaliatory, tariffs that were, associated with, President Trump, you take a look at like 2017, if you look at like the difference in terms like the trade deficit, right? There's a lot of parallels here. And the reason why there's a lot of parallels is because economics is always about behavior, right? And we can look at history as a way to understand our behavior. Well, what exactly were the conditions? Why exactly were people acting this way? Why exactly would they buy 5 houses? Why would they, do X, Y, and Z, right? What exactly were the behaviors then that would cause those behaviors that would create that economic collapse, similar to what was happening in 2007 and 2008? So let's look at the political responses that happened as a result of the Great Depression. So in 1929, the president that we have at the time is Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover was an engineer, okay, by trade. He was very much and if you know any engineers, engineers are pretty much people by the book, right? They're not, wholly imaginative. They trust and rely on their science. They trust and rely on what has been done in the past, and that's pretty much what Herbert Hoover, his approach to the Great Depression. He really thought that limited government intervention was the way to go, right? He really thought that, if people can just, figure this out, get through this period, and be able to just prioritize. His approach was to have local governments, private charities, businesses solve the crisis, right? Well, it's not a terrible idea, but what it is, it's a very limited idea. And let me tell you why it's limited. Because you want to think about, like, if you look at, I'll just pull this out for you. Let's say, if I have one. You have a dollar, okay? This dollar, it has, the United States of America, has the Treasury Secretary right there. And it says that this is from the United States and it's from the Federal Reserve note, right? So this is something that is backed by the Federal Reserve. There is no Federal Reserve at this point, right? There is nothing that's backing this money. There's nothing that gives it a guarantee, right? Herbert Hoover's approach to solving this is like, look, we can build up our confidence by strengthening our communities, by doing some individual acts, by people pulling themselves together and solving their own problem. Okay. Well, here's the issue with that is that people are heavily reliant on an employer for this, for the money, right? If the money is no longer worth something, right? If it can't buy certain goods and services, if it doesn't have the same value, meaning that people don't have the same belief in it or faith, then what this does is it changes people's behavior, right? What Herbert Hoover failed to see, and what, honestly, many people that have taken the approach that, limited government and let the economy fix itself and manage itself on its own, is that one of the things is that it never really quite considers human behavior, right? Is that limited intervention doesn't change the way that people feel, right? People need a sense of confidence. They need to know that, that I believe that my government is going to be there to make sure that this is still worth a dollar, that we can still make exchanges, that we can still have the power to purchase items. And Herbert Hoover's approach was very much laissez-faire, let's just let them figure it out. And as a result of that, we fall further into the depression from, in terms of and from 1929 to 1931 when a new president is elected. One of the reasons why this is kind of important is because you have Herbert Hoover, who is a Republican governor, who is a Republican president, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is a Democrat. Okay. For the last several decades, Republicans have controlled pretty much the House, the presidency, the Senate since Reconstruction. Okay. They've controlled it all. In 1932, that all changes with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Why? Because Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 has a new approach to how they're going to solve this. He calls it the New Deal, right? His idea is that the only thing we have to fear, as he says in his inaugural speech, is fear itself. What FDR was getting at was this idea of confidence. We have to build back our confidence, our sense of who we are and our belief. Why? Because if we believe in ourselves, if we believe in each other, if we believe in our country, our behavior is going to change. If we don't have faith in our system, if we don't have faith in our government, if we don't have faith in the way that we used to do business, then people's behaviors are going to just remain inert. No one's going to lend. No one's going to spend. No one's going to want to work. Right. And so there's going to be all these conflicts. And so one of the things that this is one of the reasons why FDR was elected to the office was because his approach was about let's get involved. Let's let government try to figure out how we can solve these problems. Right. We don't necessarily need this hands-off approach. Government doesn't have to be the problem. It can be the person that can solve the issues. Right. And so when we look at the New Deal, in terms of FDR's approach, is that it involved several different aspects. The first was going to be relief. FDR wanted to make relief a part of the experience of people, relief from the economic crises of not having a job, not having money, not having food, not having shelter, right? So what he starts to do is he starts to create Work Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, providing jobs for the unemployed, people to build bridges and dams and roads and libraries, right? All of these aspects. Anybody who's out of work, let's put them to work. Let's put them to work. Let's get them money. Let's get them money in their pockets. Let's get them spending. Let's get them consuming. Let's get this economy going. Not a bad idea, right? Sounds like a plan. He also wanted to reform. He wanted to create faith in the system, right? So that if there was a crisis, we'd be able to handle it. So what does he establish? The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, right? He wants to be able to have the ability for banks to be solvent. Should they lose their deposits, they have insurance that's backed on it. How much is it? Do you know how much you are protected by in terms of how much money you have in the bank? $250,000. So if you have that much, that is insured up to that much. If more than that, sorry, they're not going to insure you any more than that at the bank. But that was a huge boost, right? He also enacts a bank holiday, right? Why? So that you can close the banks, so the banks can recover and people can stop having to run on them. He decides to establish the Social Security Act, right? So that people wouldn't die in poverty, that there would be money at the end of your retirement, right? He creates these institutions and regulations to create a sense of confidence, right? So let's put people to work, let's build up the confidence of businesses and the systems, and then let's try to recover. Let's recover the billions of dollars that we're putting into these domestic programs because as people work, they pay taxes, they begin to put this back into the government, right? Relief, reform, recovery. That was FDR's approach, right? When we look at Herbert Hoover, one of the things that you just have to ask yourself is like, why exactly what was he thinking, right? Herbert Hoover's approach, and you can actually take a look. Oops, sorry. You can actually take a look. There's actually a great little video here on his approach in terms of how he decided to address the economy, and it's pretty much an absolute disaster, right? Hands off, very limited. We're not interested in using money to invest in programs or to get people working. And so what ends up happening is that people just slip further into the depression, right? People go hungry. People are ending up, setting up camps and villages in Central Park and in off of highways and in parks around the country. They called them Hoovervilles, right? Named after Herbert Hoover, right? This idea that people are living because they've been kicked out of their home, they've lost their possessions, they've lost their jobs, they've lost their livelihood. Now they're living in a public space, right? And so the idea that, in particular, the tariffs, that was, he had to sign off on this. This is his idea. He's like, yeah, what a great idea. Let's have this so we can bring manufacturing back. And look at what happens. GDP drops by 50%. Global trade collapses as a result of this, right? This idea of supporting private charities and everything else. Okay, so private charities are going to be able to do that, but how is that going to help? Right? If you don't have a massive influx of money into the system that actually gets people spending, it's never going to happen, right? This is one of the big things that happened as a result of the pandemic crisis, right? Many people, point to the issue of inflation as a result of what happened because of the pandemic. So if any of you remember what was going on in 2020 and 2021, remember many people were out of work in the service industry, right? Hotels, movie theaters, restaurants, right? Everybody was going under. So what do they do? Well, they create economic relief where people can apply for loans. But remember how everybody got those checks, right? My parents, both of them were retired at the time in 2020 and in 2021. Both of them got $600 checks. What do they need that for? Right? They weren't working, they weren't doing anything else, right? And remember, it was a part of our economy, a part of our working population that was affected by this. Not everybody, right? Many people, the privileged individuals were still able to go to work from home, right? They were able to do various things. Did it let many people lose their jobs? Absolutely. Were people out of work? Absolutely. And should that money have gone to those people so that they can continue to afford and continue to buy? Sure. But when you give money to people who don't necessarily need it, what did they do with it? Were they like my parents and didn't spend it and saved it? And other people who saved it and just waited and waited and waited. And then finally, when all of the opportunities to go back out and be able to go to the movies and go out to the restaurants, what ended up happening? Consumption shot up, demand shot up. Demand shot up and it didn't keep pace with consumption, right? With production. So if production was low, consumption was high, demand was high, inflation is going to go up because the value of the goods go up. This is one of the reasons why we're in this price crisis and then why we have yet to get out is because there's far too much money in the system. But the counter to this argument that many people make is like, well, had we done nothing, no money, no infusion of cash, no infusion of spending, what would have been the result? It most likely would have been an economic depression. Many people would have lost their jobs because without the consumption of at least 30 to 40% of our people, we are going to look at other businesses, other areas failing that may necessarily be like, oh, well, I'm protected, aren't I not as a teacher? Well, no, because if your students don't show up to online because they don't have the money to keep the Zoom on or the lights on or to eat, then there's nobody in school. If there's nobody in school, that's nobody's paying their taxes, then you can't get paid, right? It's always this cycle, okay? But if we look at FDR's approach into those aspects, one of the things that I really want you to recognize with FDR, it's not just the fact that he took an approach to what is known as the New Deal, but what he also did was is he created a role in terms of creating a sense of connection with the people. One of the best examples is what is known as his fireside chats. Remember, many people have radios or they have access to one, right? Whether it's at work or one of their neighbors has one, whatever the case may be. And what FDR decides to do during this period is he decides to go live to the nation once a week to have these radio broadcasts that become what is known as fireside chats. And this is an opportunity for FDR basically to push support for his programs, for his approach to solving this economic crisis, but most importantly, to connect with Americans, right? To give them a sense of like, hey, your leader is thinking about you. This is what I'm trying to do to try to solve this problem. I am trying to connect to understand it. And what he does is he creates a sense of calm and confidence. This is one of the most important things that you have to have. When you have a president like ours who, rants and raves on Twitter or goes on X or just says the most, you know, insane things on in terms of television, it doesn't build up your much confidence in terms of like who's actually in control here. Or are we going to be able to solve a crisis should one happen? Or are we just going to be in a permanent state of just unrest and unease as we are at this moment, right? This, remember, affects people in terms of their consumptions if we don't have confidence in the system. One of the things that FDR showed by example was that, hey, we need to be able to create a sense of calm, a sense of, confidence, a sense of purpose and intention going forward. We got to get people to believe that we can be better off, that if we work hard, that if we try these different things, it can be done. Go ahead and take a look at some of these videos. They're really quite cool because they talk about all of the different programs and things that services that we're doing. And one of the other things that I want to show you, shoot, what is the name of that? Let's see, Great Depression Buildings Map. I think that's what it is. Ah, yes, here it is. The Living New Deal. And I'll put this link up. This map that you see here is that you can actually take a look and see any of the buildings, roads, bridges, dams that were built during this period. And you can look by city, and I'll go with some of the more famous ones. So I'm going to choose San Francisco. Okay. And so it zooms right into San Francisco right there. And each one of these dots you can click on to see like where something was built. So if I click on this, right? And here it is. It says right here, Golden Gate Bridge, Northern Approach Road to Sausalito. So you guys, know what exactly the Golden Gate Bridge looks like, right? But you can also look at other things, the Lincoln Boulevard, and sometimes they will have pictures of what's there if it's still there. So like you see like Yacht Harbor here in San Francisco. Where I grew up over here in Oakland, there's actually quite a few aspects. Is that you have what is known as Diamond Park. This was built as a result. It actually gives you, the program. This would be the WPA Work Relief Program. So these were people who were unemployed, building a park, right? Being employed by the federal government. Yeah, it's a temporary period of work. It's not fixed, but at least you get some money, get some payments going, right? And this is how it would happen. And so what's really cool is that you can look at a lot of the areas here, like they'll even show you like some of the areas like the street improvements. The exposition building, this was torn down, but this used to be up there. Some of the murals that are still in the post office, these are actually still up. And so what's really cool is that you can go to anywhere. And so here I'll just choose Baltimore so that you can look and see. I have to type in the whole city. Oh, because I spelt it wrong. Baltimore. There we go. There you go. Baltimore National Cemetery. There you go. So it'll zoom right in it for you. And so if you take a look at this, the Baltimore National Cemetery, built by WPA. The nice thing is that you can pull out here and we can even go a little bit closer. So if you want to take a look at 5th Regiment Armory Building, I think this one is, no longer, I don't even know if it's still there. Let's see. Because, you can actually click on it and it says right there, um, it's Armory built for the National Guard. Is it still there? Hmm. Interesting. But yeah, but see, these are the sort of things that you can look at. And, so like, oh, like here's a great example. Preston Gardens restoration. So this is not too far. I mean, this is changed because there's actually a freeway that's over it. But if you see that bypass and stuff, all those areas, that walkway and those buildings that are over there, that's that area. So, it's still there today. And this is what's really cool about, the Living New Deal is that you can see, various products, the roads, the bridges, that were built as a result. I'm sure if you guys have seen, the Coast Guard ship that's, parked in the docks there, you can see that, very cool stuff. High schools, Southern High School that was built at the time. You can see all these things, parks, Forest Golf and all that other things. So, just take a look. I mean, as you can see, like you can see the concentration in areas like New York, Washington, D.C., areas like that. But I mean, it's pretty much all over the country, right? We're talking all over. I mean, of course, many of the investments that were being made at the time were in the areas where there was the highest degree of need of work. So, of course, in the major cities, but that doesn't mean that other areas weren't covered as well. Okay. So let's take a look at some of the responses of the 2007-2008 crisis. Now, in 2007, the president was George W. Bush. Um, George Bush the second, right? He was the son of H.W. Of Herbert Walker Bush. Um, he is there is an election going on as the crisis is unfolding in 2007. Two people are running, Senator John McCain and Senator Barack Obama. Senator McCain is from Arizona, Senator Barack Obama is from the state of Illinois. And so what ends up happening is that they both decide to suspend their campaigns at this time so that they can help address this, be in the Senate to help solve these problems. Now, there were many issues that were going on right here. Is that unlike the the approach of Herbert Hoover, George Bush wanted to get involved, right? He wanted his Treasury Secretary. He wanted the head of the FDIC. He wanted the head of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, everybody to get involved and to figure this thing out. Well, one of the problems about this is that there was this legislation that was passed. It took two goes to get passed, but it was known as TARP. It was called Troubled Assets Relief Program. Essentially, what it is that it gave money, federal money, to the banks to purchase these toxic assets that were basically causing the collapse and the confidence in the system to be at an all-time low. The idea is that the banks get money from the federal government. They take that money and they lend it back out to people so that they can pay for their homes, that they can get a better mortgage, that they can, start a business, they can go to school, whatever the case may be, right? This was, not a bad idea, right? Okay, sounds like a good idea in terms of the stabilization, right? However, the problem is that the banks never did it. They actually never lent out the money. They just kept it. And so the economy, it took a while for it to re-stimulate itself, but as a result, millions of people lost hundreds of thousands of dollars on the stock market in terms of their 401ks. People lost their homes. People lost businesses, right? This was an absolute disaster. Just for your FYI, I actually in 2007, that's when I bought my house in California, right? You want to know how much they were able to give me with no money down, even though I had pretty good credit. I had actually very good credit and I had a lot of assets. I was able to get a loan for $950,000 with 0% down. Yes. And was it an adjustable rate mortgage? You bet it was. And so by around 2008, I was screwed. Why? Because as a result of the crisis, I lost three-quarters of everything that I had of value. So all of my stocks were gone. Everything had disappeared. I basically lost three-quarters of my wealth, but I still had my house. And so that was where my wealth now resided. So I had to keep it. And so that was what my goal was, to make sure that I could keep my house. So did I sell furniture? Did I, take in boarders, people to stay for a little while, whatever I needed to do, because that was the only asset that had some real money. And then later on in 2019, I sold the house and was able to make a nice profit when I decided to move my family out into to Atlanta and move everybody out there. But that was one approach. So TARP didn't necessarily work. Okay. With the Americans with Recovery and Reinvestment Act, this was another approach. This was tax cuts. This was basically meant to struggle homeowners. Once again, didn't get to the right people, didn't really help anybody. I certainly didn't get any money on this. This was one of those issues, but you may remember that there was also other programs that when President Barack Obama is elected, excuse me, when Senator Barack Obama is elected president of the United States, he begins other programs, to try to get people to buy goods and services. So one of these was called Cash for Clunkers. The idea was is that you would turn in your old car that wasn't worth much to a dealer to get a new car. That money, part of that $800 billion package, was coming from the federal government to car manufacturers. So Toyotas, American car companies, dealerships, right? So that people would just come in and buy, right? That they would sign, and that knowing that, hey, if they could just pay for this down payment or have no down payment and get a better car, we can not only get people in cars, keep them spending, but we can also get polluters off the road, right? And we all get the benefit on this. Doesn't sound like too bad of an idea. Problem is, it didn't work either. Right? People didn't really buy cars at the time like that because they necessarily couldn't afford it. And if they did, they ended up having a problem getting their car repossessed within a year or two later. So it wasn't exactly the most successful thing. Probably the one of the most long-term aspects of this period was what is known as the Dodd-Frank or Glass-Steagall, the building up the Glass-Steagall Consumer Protection Act. This essentially was further regulations on banks to be able to hold assets, to be able to not sell toxic assets, and knowing that they were toxic, being able to protect people in terms of the regulation, right? So it requires that banks have stronger capital investments, that they have, more liquidity, that they are more solvent, right? That there's more regulation in terms of these, packaging of assets that people really don't know what they're buying, right? That you have to be clear on that. But what has most importantly happened is that it has changed the way that people have been able to get into the market. So right now we talk a lot about this issue of affordability with housing. Well, there's a reason why houses are expensive. One of the main reasons that houses are expensive is because we have a problem um, in terms of the availability of housing, right? What we would consider in terms of the product, right? There's a demand, and then there's also the amount, right? And so when we have a high demand but a low supply, right? If supply of housing is low, then we're going to have people that the prices are going to continue to go up. One of the issues is that, having a mortgage, right, requires you to now have a very solid credit rating, right? You have to be able to have yourself in the 650 range, if not higher, right? 650 used to be, that was the low end. Now banks are like, look, we're a little bit more concerned about your ability to be able to pay back. We need to see a strong credit rating. But it's not just the strong credit rating, it's also the down payment. 20% used to be the standard. But if you're looking at what 20% is on $1 million home, you're looking at $200,000. But 20% isn't enough. Sometimes banks are wanting to see 30%, right? 40%. And especially if you do not have a credit score that's extremely strong, 720 and above, then they're going to expect a lot more for you to put down towards the down payment to afford this mortgage. That was a result of Dodd-Frank. Does it have some abilities to create a strength and, strengthening in terms of the banking system and its resilience when there are these periods of crises? Certainly. But here's where the problem is that we have many people who are just unable to get into the market because of the affordability of being able to meet those demands of where, Dodd-Frank put us as a result of the financial crisis. So has Dodd-Frank been, scratched away in some ways? Yes. But right now, it's still very difficult. And so the people that, one of the ways that they are making changes that they're actually trying to help people to get into the market is um, to allow people to take over the mortgages of people on certain loans. So if you have a traditional loan or you have a VA loan or an FHA loan, right? Let's say that you have an interest rate on your mortgage of, let's say, like 2.9%, 3.2, 3.6, something that's far lower than 6%. That loan may be able to qualify for a transfer, meaning that the person who takes over your mortgage and thus buys your house assumes that. And that can be part of this opportunity for getting other people into the market. It still requires a large cash down payment. It still requires, a lot of work and due diligence. It's not an easy thing to do, but I'll put an article up here that was posted on NPR that might be something of interest as a way to address it. Why? Because the main group that has these low rate mortgages are people who bought before 2020 and people who have sat on their mortgages or don't even or may not even have a significant amount of money on their mortgage, right? We're talking about people who are from or the baby boomer generation, right? These are people who have enormous assets. They may be sitting on a very strong asset that has a high value, and maybe they have let's say $100,000 left on their mortgage, at 2.5%, this might be ideal. And, just so you know, these rates in terms of the mortgages, they have changed. When I was, first bought in California in 2007, the interest rate was zero. By, 2019, the interest rate had certainly ticked up to about 2.5, 3%. But I had a mortgage rate when I bought the house in Atlanta, it was at 2.5%. Now because I did a refinance to be able to pull some money out, and this was in 2021, and the interest rates were then hovering at about 3.7. So I have a 3.6 now, but now you see what other people have, 6%, 7, you know, that's a lot of money to be paying on an $850,000 house or a $900,000 home, or the houses like right now in where I have in Atlanta, these are all $1 million homes. There's nothing extraordinary about the homes. They're just in really nice areas and because there is a low supply and a high demand, right? But that's changing, right? There are many people that are looking for other cities to live in because of the cost of living. Maybe they're looking at other types of lifestyles, maybe living with multi-generational, right? They're not looking just at a single family home, but they need more room. And so, these are some of the things that you want to consider. But the most important thing that's going to carry us into this period, into World War II, and what I'm going to cover, in the next lecture is how economic uncertainty, how it affects people's behavior, creates social anxiety. And what I want you to understand is how social anxiety can trigger and affect people's behaviors in terms of doing and not doing something, right? How it affects the way that we recover ourselves from economic periods of stress. And for those of you who are like 20 something, you've experienced nothing but pretty much economic uncertainty since you were born. So if you were born after 2001, let's just say after September 11th, 2001, you've experienced nothing but economic insecurity, right? You've never experienced anything but social anxiety. And so that makes it very difficult when you see how social anxiety plays into your behaviors, not just in terms of your consumption, but in terms of your experiences, your relationships, the idea of getting married, having children, whether or not you move, whether or not you move more often, whether or not you decide to take care of your parents or don't or whatever, right? These are the aspects in terms of that social anxiety that really affect people's changes in their behaviors, especially when it comes to politics. And what we're going to look at is that I'm going to show you how this economic period of uncertainty, what it was doing in 2007, 2008, and how it's trickled on down to this current period, how the period from the late 1920s through the 1930s contributed to an economic uncertainty. That economic uncertainty created a general level of intolerance, and how that intolerance has fed into bigotry, prejudice, racism, and overall hate. Very similar to what we're seeing now in terms of those parallels, in terms of the treatments of, various groups in our society, particularly immigrants and people of color. Okay, so if you have any questions or any comments or concerns, feel free to reach out to me via text or email or call. But just look forward to the next lecture.